Good morning, beloved community. Good morning. I am Kim Mayong. I'm the New York State Director for the Children's Defense Fund, and it is my pleasure to be part of our Children's Policy and Power Plenary. Our theme today is family stability and economic mobility. And we begin with the sacred truth that families are the first place where children learn what it means to be safe, to be seen, and to belong. And when families have what they need to thrive, children are free to imagine, learn, and grow into all that they can be. Amen. What's going on here? Our session is rooted in the promise that families can flourish when they are supported by just families and strong communities. But we must first name the problems standing in our way. Too many children in this family live with economic uncertainty. Families of color face persistent barriers to wealth, economic opportunity, and stability. And systems continue to prioritize punishment over support, short-term fixes over generational investment. At the Children's Defense Fund, we believe that family stability and economic mobility are rights, not luxuries or rewards, and every child deserves a nurturing home and a household not burdened by scarcity, housing insecurity, or poverty. And this outcome, where systems prioritize punishment over support and family unity, is not inevitable. It's the result of avoidable policy choices, which we will talk about today. And together, we will choose a new way. The path forward must center families together, not just individuals. It must challenge unjust economic systems, repair historic harms, and invest in conditions where all children can be safe, secure, and free. So, together, we will explore what it takes to transform these punishing systems into ones that uphold dignity, equity, and opportunity. Some things we're going to do today is to reframe poverty and instability as the result of policy design, not personal or family failure. That's right. We will explore bold economic policies that support generational stability and mobility. We will lift up a public theology of equity, care, and justice. And this will equip us to organize for income supports, child welfare transformation, and ultimately, family dignity. These are all issues close to the heart of the Children's Defense Fund's work in New York State, where we advocate for child welfare policies that keep families together rather than stigmatize poor families and threaten to tear them apart. We recently completed a direct cash transfer pilot where we gave $1,000 in cash to 100 recently exited foster care youth for 1 year, and we studied the outcomes. With the goal of advocating for public policy change. And we have recently released a report. I have some flyer or postcards here which show you where to get it, but if you don't see me, you can go to the Children's Defense Fund's website, to the New York State page, and you can see a link to it. So we had some surprising, well, not surprising to us, but findings that might surprise the general public. We found that cash made the youth's life more stable, it improved their mental health, and contrary to popular wisdom, it made them more likely, not less, to participate in the formal economy and have stable jobs because it gave them mental and economic stability. So that's what we need. We need more of that. We need permanent policy like that. And we recently also advocated for successful expansion of our child state tax credit, a state housing voucher, and universal school meals across New York State, all of which, unfortunately, we now will have to fight to protect in light of recent policy cuts. But we're ready for it. We're ready for the fight. And so, without further ado, we're joined by two prophetic public scholars who call upon us to imagine the kind of future that we want and identify specific policy tools which can bring it into view. They're both really nice and humble, but they are so accomplished that I can only offer you a very brief overview of their accomplishments. Dr. Derek Hamilton is the Henry Cohen Professor of Economics and Public Policy at the New School in New York City. He is the founding director of the New School's Institute on Race, Power, and Political Economy. As one of the country's premier scholars and economists, he has been profiled in New York Times, Mother Jones, the Wall Street Journal, and Politico. He's a member of the Marguerite Casey Foundation in partnership with the Group Health Foundation's inaugural Class of Freedom Scholars. He was on the Biden-Sanders Unity Task Force Economic Committee and has testified extensively before congressional committees and governmental bodies. He's also been involved in crafting policy proposals such as baby bonds and a federal job guarantee, some of which we'll talk about today, and which have inspired significant federal, state, and local legislative proposals, including in New York State. He holds a PhD in economics from the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and a BA in economics from Oberlin College. The Reverend Carrie Day is the Elmer G. Hamrichhausen Professor of Constructive Theology and African American Religion at the Princeton Theological Seminary in Princeton, New Jersey. Dr. Day is the first African American woman to be promoted to full professor in the over 200-year history of Princeton Theological Seminary, where she is currently the theology department chair. She has been recognized by NBC News as one of 6 Black women at the center of gravity in American theological education. Her work focuses on feminist and womanist theologies, social critical theory, cultural studies, economics, and Afro-Pentecostalism, and has authored many books on these topics. She's a board member of the American Academy of Religion and an editorial board member of the Journal of World Christianity. She also engages extensively with public policy and public policy leaders, including White House briefings, and has written for New York Daily News, The Christian Century, Feminist Wire, and Huffington Post. She holds a PhD in religion from Vanderbilt, an MA in religion and ethics from Yale Divinity School, and a bachelor's in political science and economics from Tennessee State. So please welcome them, and we're going to move on to the chairs. All right. Is this on? Is this on? Yeah. Oh. So I'm going to start with one question for both of you, and this is going to be kind of a conversation, and we'll also give you guys time to participate in that. So the first question is, in this policy zone, we're called to move from scarcity to abundance. So what does it mean? That's right. What does it mean to build an economy where families are supported and not punished? And what does that look like for our children?
You want me to start?
And either one.
Oh, okay. Well, first, gratitude. Thank you for this honor to be at this historic site, to speak before this historic body. I also want to get into the question by saying that this is exactly what we need. We need more people grounded in spirituality and morality that's doing work on economics.
That's right.
I'm an economics professor. I'm an economics professor, and we fundamentally start with 3 questions: what, how, and to whom. The question that is missing is why. Why do we have an economy? And to answer that question, that starts with a set of values, a set of norms. So the issue of abundance, there's a new book out also that I don't know if people have seen it, but it's getting a lot of attention. It's written by Ezra Klein and I believe Michael Thompson. It's called Abundance. And frankly, I think it's a co-optation of the understanding of abundance.
Yes, yes.
The book essentially is arguing that we should unleash productivity, and that issues like zoning restrictions, issues around concerning inclusion, that it is the progressive movement of trying to think about the ways in which we direct public resources that is getting in the way of productivity, that if we unleash the productive capacities of firms, that it will lead to what they argue is a deliverance that will essentially trickle down to all of us. So we've seen this before. So what is problematic with that framework that they're presenting is that first it co-opts the notion of abundance. Abundance comes from other scholars who have argued that in order to generate profits, scarcity is manufactured. Right. So it is through scarcity that profit can be generated. It is the book is the original conception is that if we were to get beyond the manufacturing of scarcity, that it could lead to a better society. So what is problematic about their book is it's anemic in power. It doesn't recognize some of the power distortions that take place.
That's right.
So I'm rambling on. Let me just get to conclusions, and then so we can have a lively conversation. But essentially, the concept of abundance is grounded in a notion that we, in the United States especially, we have the wealthiest nation in the history of mankind, yet we have high concentrations of both economic power as well as political power. It is through economic power that political power also consolidates at the top. I don't begrudge the wealthy because they're wealthy. I begrudge the ways in which that wealth translates into political power and co-optation in ways that we can't solve our existential crises. And then I'll give one other point on this, which is, what is the mechanism by which power can concentrate and iterate at the top for so long? It is the weaponization of relative status. This is where racism, sexism, and the ways in which people get divided into groups, the ways in which Donald Trump is able to basically co-opt a nation into fascism. It is a bipartisan economy that has led to this gross disparity, and bipartisan, Democrats and Republicans have led to the conditions that we're in that have made us vulnerable to a strong man who's come in and told a politically dominant group that however bad your lot in life may be, at least you're not them. And I will protect you in a relative way, right? That's the strategy. We're naive if we just think it's simply ignorance or bigotry. And why do we care about this? Because we need to understand the inseparabilities of economics, politics, race, gender, the ways in which they all intertwine at a macro level so that we can present something different. And in order to present something different, we need to claim it. So we need to answer that question, what is the purpose of an economy? And Dr. King did it eloquently. When Dr. King talks about power, he basically argues that power is nothing but the ability, the purpose to achieve something. I'm paraphrasing a little bit. But he also goes in and talks about the connections between power and love. He says, power without love is abusive. And he used another word, I can't remember, my feeble mind. Then he also has an admonition, he admonishes us. He argues that love without power is anemic and sentimental. So at the end of the day, our values are critical, but they're not enough. We need to be focused on movement building, on building power, so we get to define an economy. We get to define the economy we want, and then we need to get into the business of building power and movement so that we can achieve it.
And I just want to pick up on what Professor Hamilton said about needing to really think about the purpose of the economy. Because right now, as economists and policies are set, I mean, this is, right, it predates the Republicanism, MAGA, and Trump, right? This is something that's been ongoing within the US, that we need to think about the normative framework of the economy, the why. You know, so I majored in political science and economics as sort of a prefacing comment, and it wasn't until I was actually getting a master's in theological education, for example, that I really understood that at the beginning of the 20th century, there was pretty much a pretty large restructuring of even departments of economics, where at one point it was called political economy. And when you even go back into, say, you know, the early 19th century, political economy was a branch of moral philosophy, right? And so even the idea, like the way in which economy is siloed as this kind of abstraction, it's faceless, it's absent of human beings, it's absent of social locations and so forth, is a real problem. And part of that, you know, the understanding of the purpose of the economy, I think one thing that, one major truth that the Christian story teaches us is that institutions are in service to people. Structures are in service to people, not the other way around. But talking about the economy as an abstraction, you get the sense of whenever we're talking about the flourishing of the economy, we're talking about the rational productive worker, right? Productivity, as you said. So that in many ways, it's the economy that is seen as the lifeblood instead of communities that are the lifeblood. So in other words, the desired end is not the economy as such, whatever that abstraction is. The desired end is a flourishing people. And again, the Christian story teaches us that because the economy is a means to an end, the production and distribution and consumption of the goods that we share in common, that, I mean, a part of the story is that in many ways, the economy is made for us. We give in many ways, but part of why the economy is even present is not just so that we can give to others, but so that we can give of ourselves to others. It's this ethics of relationality, in other words. It's not just about the materiality, right? Although materiality is really important, but ultimately how we are sharing and living in the world together, right? And how we are self-actualizing. And so I think that this really needs to be amplified. And I want to note here there are theological equivalents and expressions to the sort of neoliberal economic logic that we're talking about. Here's one example, and this is like really on the top of my mind because I was having a conversation with a dear pastoral friend. Here's one example in talking about how institutions serve people, not the other way around, and therefore economies serve people and not the other way around. For example, when pastors are building these gargantuan sanctuaries, right, and they begin sucking and bleeding the people dry, depending on their money, right, in order to meet the building fund that they have. And as you can see, this is a problem, right, and even blaming the people when the benchmarks are not met. I've seen this in action. In pulpits where the people are berated. I mean, this is kind of like, neoliberal economic free markets, Chicago school style economics, dressed up in liberated Christian garb. That's what it is, right? So there are like theological equivalents here, right, that we should be attentive to. And also something that I have tried to amplify in my work is, what does it mean, right, when we're doing this, say, to the people in the pew, when between 80 to 85% of black church membership are working class black women and queer folk? What does that mean, right? When this institution is being built on the pennies, and this is something that black women, right, have been talking about, dating all the way back to the middle of the 1800s, then what does it mean? And so then the last thing I'll say, a part of what I have been committed to amplifying within my work is an intersectional approach. And hopefully we'll be able to talk about that more, but an intersectional approach to the building of economies, to the flourishing of families, and to a conception of abundance. And what I mean by intersectional is sort of the multi-positionality of people, right? Like, I am a black woman, black women, queer folk, economically disadvantaged folk, differently abled folk, questions around nationality, all of these different things, the difference that constitutes our community, and why we need to be attentive in particular, at least for my work, to black women and black queer folks.
That's right. Forgive me, Trevor, wherever you are, for going off script so early in the panel, but I promise this will be quick. Just to react to some of those themes. Dr. Hamilton referred to the current stance of our federal administration, and we are coming weeks after the passage of a big, brutal bill that will take away health care, school services, student loans from our community's essential services, that then states will be, required to try to meet the gap, and where gains in places like New York, as I mentioned before, are now threatened in future years, all in the service of tax cuts that support corporate institutions. And I think it's an important point in terms of religion and what the service, what the institutions are meant to serve, and what are the ideals of religion. We've talked about throughout this convening about this type of community being a bulwark to the evangelical right, which is just moving the same religion and principles in a very different way. And so I think it's so important that we keep doing this, keep connecting, and doing this work and figuring out how we can advance the very policies that we are talking about. And do you guys have anything further to add briefly on that before I go back to script?
I mean, the tax code is the biggest fiscal tool we have and should reflect values. And what just took place is structuring inequality. It's the biggest wealth transfer of our public resources. And then there's an added aspect of being mean-spirited. The cuts to Medicaid are not going to pay for it. And frankly, this pay for is a trap anyway. The United States government is not like your household. As long as the United States government is directing resources for productive use, that's not inflationary, that grows an economy. And the ways in which we direct resources are choices. So back to the questions, right? Poverty is a policy choice.
Yes.
So what just took place, and then I guess the way in which we can understand it, it passed in this context, again, by which both Democrats and Republicans are responsible. So what was just described about this neoliberal economy that centers the firm, that centers their productivity for our salvation. And what we're talking about is not socialism or capitalism per se. We're talking about an economy that invests in our most treasured resources. That is people and the environments in which we live. Not simply because people are inputs into a labor process, or that people are consumer agents that should be redressed with some charitable contributions to support their consumption habits. But I holistically believe that we are ingenious, that we are innovative, and that under the right structures and resources, with the right investments, we will do what we do best, which is innovate, have self-determination, and promote tranquility.
Thank you. Anything? Oops. So before the next question, if the tech gods would, if it's still possible at this point, to turn on the timer so that I can be aware of where we're at starting from now, that would be great. If not, I'll do my best. For Dr. Hamilton, I wanted to dig in a little bit about some of the specific policy proposals that you've advocated for, like baby bonds and guaranteed income, and if you could define both of those briefly for our audience, and how those types of policies will move us toward the type of policy framework that supports communities and families.
Yeah, and I use that word paradigm change, and I used it because basically you need values and policies. You need a definition of what a North Star is. We need to define what is our goal. And I said it, it's an economy that centers people and the environments in which we live. The environment part is the indigenous concept. One is obvious, we can't survive and thrive without an environment. But the literal personification of an environment in a spiritual sense is a value that we need to adopt. So with that vision, that value, the policy framework is basically inclusive economic rights. And this is not new. Coming out of World War II, the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights named 5 rights: civil rights, political rights, social rights, cultural rights, and economic rights. It wasn't even only them. If we think about the transformation of Martin Luther King, if we think about the freedom budget, if we think about the civil rights movement and some of the unsung heroes like Bayard Rustin and A. Philip Randolph and countless numbers of women that aren't included in our narrative, it was founded on economic rights. So anything, when you talk about human rights, any subset of those 5 that I named are co-optations of freedom. So to talk about being able to vote when you're hungry, to talk about being able to civilly protest when you're unhoused, that's not freedom, that's not choice. That naturalizes poverty because it puts the onus of responsibility on the individual. In order to fulfill freedom, one needs some resources. Otherwise, you're vulnerable to exploitation of somebody else who has resources or their charitable inkling. So I'm going to put a hold on it. The policies, I don't think are that hard. You started off talking about guaranteed income. King said it too. The most direct way to abolish poverty is to abolish poverty. People are poor because they don't have enough money. Right. Just that simple. So baby bonds is another policy that's getting a lot of attention, to which I'm the architect. Baby bonds is a birthright to capital. It understands that in order to generate wealth, you need capital. The ways in which people get wealth is the difference between a homeowner and a renter is a down payment. The difference between a worker and an entrepreneur, and by the way, we over-index on entrepreneurship, and that might be controversial. People should have the agency to choose entrepreneurship, not be pushed into entrepreneurship. Right. But if you have an innovative idea, the difference between a worker who has to go to somebody with capital versus being able to go to market with their idea is capital. And then a debt-free college education. So baby bonds, right? I'm going to put a button on it. There's basically, without the vision, we end up in scenarios where I might be competing to say, well, I support baby bonds, you support guaranteed income. Give us, we fight against each other. If we have the vision, it's a recognition that there are many dimensions of salvation in an economic sense, and we need to work together to ensure that any item without which, so goods, services, and resources without which you don't have agency in your lives, the government has a fiduciary responsibility to invest in those resources, not handouts. Why is it that every line on a federal ledger that goes to people is considered a cost, whereas the line going to firms is considered an investment? Come on now. So again, I certainly, because you've been brilliant up here, so I'm not going to keep talking, but I'm just going to say that. Right, so essentially, in order for us to have agency, we need all of the human rights, and we need to do them in an inclusive way. So why do I even add the word inclusive? We know from history when Social Security was originally passed, it excluded domestic and agricultural workers. At the time, black women employed, 90% of them were in that category, and over half of black men. So in this iteration, and by the way, the backlash and how we ended up in the neoliberal movement and period was to scapegoat and demonize black people because of the gains made from civil rights as being undeserving, and government being tyrannical in offering these undeserving individuals charitable resources that at worst will lead to deficit behaviors, that will lead to detrimental behaviors for their own selves. So the politics and the economics and the racism, the sexism are all intertwined. So in this iteration of economic rights, like Social Security, we need to make sure that they are affirmatively inclusive in the way we design, manage, and implement them to ensure that the most marginalized amongst us are affirmatively included, be it a queer person, be it and you know what, black people are getting a little nativist in this genre right now. If we believe in rights, and a person who came from a different land should also have the access to humanity.
Thank you for that. That's right. That type of coalition building with other targeted is just, something that's really important. So to Dr. Day, you have argued that economic injustice is a theological issue. So what are ways that faith communities can become frontline advocates for income supports, asset building, and economic liberation?
Wow, there's just so much there. I almost want to jump on some of what you said, but in talking about, at least from my work, what I've tried to amplify in talking about spiritual practices or practices that faith communities in particular can cultivate as a way of getting at the issues of political recognition and economic equity and policy design that Professor Hamilton is talking about is, this seems like intuitive to probably most of us sitting in this room, but when you match this intuition to actually what is happening on the ground in many faith communities, I can speak as an African American within black churches, what's happening in black churches, is that we need to be tutored by black women and black queer folk. This is really, really, really important. On a theological level, for certain, I've been deeply informed by decolonial womanist and black feminist religious and theological thought, right? That if you want to know something about what God is doing in the world, you turn to those that are seen as disposable and dispossessed, right? To get a sense of where God wants us to be, okay? And I think that for me as faith communities, that is first a fundamental theological commitment. Not simply first a social or political commitment, but fundamentally a theological commitment that says something about what it means to be Christian, right? What it means to be Christian, or for other religious traditions. This is just doesn't just show up, right, in Christianity as such. This shows up across the board in many other religious traditions. And so that says something where God is, but I think it translates then into our political activism, our political engagement, how we think about policy design. And I'm so happy you said near the end that it's about thinking about sort of the inclusive politics with respect to policy design. But that involves actually taking seriously, let's say within the black community, because you're right, there's a kind of nativism, right, going native, within the black community, that it actually matters the way in which queer folks are being stripped of their economic and political rights right now, that is a central issue that black communities should be addressing, right? I've been a part of discussions, quite literally, from directing a black church studies program in another institution and engaging black pastors, to being at Princeton, where the conversation at times was, well, this is the black church studies program. Why can't the other groups go and get their own program, right? So again, there's this disconnect, right? But again, it goes back to being tutored by black women and black queer folks. Like, here are some examples, right, in terms of a bibliography. Dolores Williams, a womanist theologian, right, that speaks to the problem of surrogacy, not only within the American nation, but also within black church communities. The way, and I think of Joy James here, the captive maternal, the way in which black women's reproductive care or their care for communities actually becomes that which is co-opted and used for the state, right, to actually reproduce systems of violence, right? Now, women, we do the care regardless, because we understand from an agential perspective that we must take care of our children, right, and our grandchildren and our communities. But this is one example, right, where we're tutored that we need to have a kind of deep listening and a deep solidarity theologically, right, with black women. I'm thinking here of a very good friend of mine, Tamora Lomax's work, right, and I think by extension, because she handles, Dr. Lomax handles Dr. Will Gaffney's work so well in terms of how we are interpreting scripture within our communities, right? You think of the terrible cultural representations that black women have had delivered, which is really interesting because even like, for example, economist Julianne Malveaux in her work shows that in the middle of the 20th century, actually black women had some of the highest rates of employment, of sort of job market engagement, but yet they're seen in Tracy West's words oftentimes, particularly poor black women, as pimping the system based off their reproductive capabilities, right? Raising criminal black children. That's the way, and you hear this from the pulpit in the kind of Jezebel tropes, right, according to Dr. Lomax, that are just recycled, right? So that's, but then I'm thinking here of like queer, you know, black, Audre Lorde, as well as Alexis Pauline Gumbs, a prolific poet, right, who just wrote a book on Audre Lorde, right, of the life of Audre Lorde, and thinking about, you know, the way in which, for example, the arts, you know, continues to be essential. You know, right now, I feel like a lot of the discussion, as it should be, in terms of talking about policy transformation, certainly is about like material arrangements and ideas, right? Concerning like who people are or the kinds of mechanisms that we need to have in terms of policies. But I think it's also important to build the kind of effective economies that will sustain the justice work. In other words, people have ideas about the world, about political life, about policy, because certain political emotions bind them to that, right? We're living in a world, think of white Christian nationalism, where it's not rational what they think, but it's deeply emotional what they think, right, and what they've been taught. And so that's what I mean by cultivating effective economies. And queer folks, black queer folks that I mentioned, have just taught us that. I'm thinking here of, in terms of being tutored by black women and black queer folks, I just mentioned Julianne Malveaux, a black woman economist, but Nina Banks, I really enjoy her work, and Sadie, I believe Alexandra, I think I have her name right. I mean, this is someone that I just stumbled upon like 10 years ago, a primary black woman economist at the beginning of the 20th century, talking about black economic life, centering black women at the center in issues concerning black women. I mean, Julianne Malveaux picks up on this. If you're gonna talk about, theologically speaking, spiritual practices of care, how we support black families and families more broadly, we have to talk about women who are the primary caretakers of children and their issues, reproductive care, health care, child care, these sorts of things. But Sadie Alexandra in some ways is already centering child care, is already centering, you know, health care, and predates like people like E. Franklin Frazier, right, who in the middle of the 20th century was sort of supplying some of that sociological analysis in terms of black folks, what we needed economically, socially, and politically. And so all of that to say that there is a reservoir of thought and activism. I mean, think of Ella Baker, right? I mean, I mean, Ella Baker for at least this particular conference, who talks about leadership and political participation, and it's in the collective model of leadership and political participation. So we need to get rid of like models like a cult of heroic genius, where it's about the lone individual and oftentimes male leader leading, that defines a movement. But all of this, right, that these women already have on offer to us. It's like an offering of ways that we can rethink how do we attend and deeply listen and practice deep solidarity. And I'll just say something here about solidarity and then I'll stop. That I think oftentimes what happens with solidarity is really the practice of a kind of benevolent paternalism. Whether it's, you know, wealthy organizations funding marginalized groups, and don't get me wrong, it's complicated terrain, we need funding, but funding marginalized groups, or let's say within church institutions, because I'm in those institutions, a primarily male clergy, disproportionate male clergy, that is making room for women to have their say, that this is a kind of benevolent paternalism where you're trying to speak for people instead of speaking with people. And so going back to, I believe the language that you use, which I think is on point, the architects, right, of policy design, that, the politics of inclusion is a really tricky thing. And it can actually recapitulate to a kind of status quo and widen the gaps of disparity, right? But that in some ways, it is about how we are allowing, again, Black women and Black queer folks to be architects, not even allowing, that's wrong, how we are acknowledging, right, and surrendering to voices that centuries long, has been trying to inform and shape the way in which we should, as faith communities, join the struggle of justice.
That's right, and I want to, that's right, that's all, absolutely on point. And I want to also go back to your point about Black women and the narratives of Black women when they're actually quite productive and engaged, but there's different narratives socially that really marginalize them in their contributions. So, and we've referred to this, that these themes have come out throughout the morning in our conversation, including guaranteed income and what the impact would be on recently transitioned foster care and other poor youth, whether it makes them more or less likely to work. And so, part of CDF's work is to challenge these narratives about communities of color and poor communities and poor families. And so what are some of these essential narratives that need to be reframed and how?
Are you doing that?
Sure. So right now we manage poverty. We socially isolate them, we incarcerate them, we conscript them to our military, and we control their family formation, fertility, and reproduction.
Yes.
We don't invest in poverty. We don't invest in people, not poverty. We don't invest in people. So rather than manage, invest in them and get out the way. So, if it's okay, I also wanted to go back and say a little bit on intersectionality. So another prominent scholar, economist, well actually Ezra Klein is a journalist, not an economist, Raj Chetty, has tax records, and not so long ago he produced a study that looked at across generations, and this is relevant, if a child grows up, Black or white, in a more affluent household versus a less affluent household, if he compared Black women to white women, and he found that there was not much distinction in class mobility across race. Then he looked at Black men and argued that there were unique challenges that Black men faced because they had downward mobility. Raj Chetty's study was myopic and wrong. It was myopic and wrong because you can't so neatly disaggregate Black men and women from larger family contexts. So if you imagine a context in which you have high incarceration rates, it's not so far-fetched that a Black woman with a college degree marries or is not married, given this context, and the family responsibility and caregiving bestowed upon her would be different than a white woman whose spouse perhaps is a corporate lawyer. Also, he looked at individual income, not family income, or wealth. If one were to look at wealth, you see gaping gaps between Black women and white women across education. It grows with age. And wealth is a more foundational, powerful input in defining economic agency than income. So why am I bringing this up? I'm bringing this up because I'd say intersectionality has various nuances. And by the way, Sadie Alexander was the first black economist, not just first black woman economist. She was the first black economist, period, and was not able to practice economics because of discrimination. So she was a professor, but had to go to a law school. And Nina Banks, shout out to her because she does all this work. She had to go and practice in a law school because at the time, they would not admit her into an economics department. But nonetheless, if we were to define the humanity of identity, I think there are two elements. One, it is inhumane to ask anybody to not celebrate the culture and the aesthetic of who they are and what group they belong to. And second, your identity should have no psychological or material advantage or disadvantage in a transactional way. So those are the frameworks by which we should define the humanity of somebody being able to have their identity. It is inhumane to ask anybody to give up their identity. And it's equally inhumane if that identity has transactional value or psychological value in a transactional way. And then here's the other big point. It gets weaponized in our political economy to concentrate power at the top. It is through these cleavages, for example, the word solidarity that you use, it can't be interest convergence. So if we say, well, black and white people should have class solidarity because it makes more sense when they negotiate in a capitalist way against the firm structure, that's not enough because there'll be another context in which one of those groups may have a material relative advantage and that coalition doesn't last. I'm speaking to a group of spiritual individuals. That solidarity has to be more spiritual. Yes. That's to be more grounded in a humanistic value. And then we get the added effect of being able to negotiate for better wages. So we need a redefinition of solidarity. One other title is, I'm the chief economist for AFL-CIO, and a big goal is to try to get our unions to lead this movement because there's people power and money power. We will not have enough money power to win this game, but we got the people power. And who better to lead than unions? But unions, in my view, need a better definition of solidarity in order for us to achieve that economy and paradigm that we all need.
And I just wanted to add a couple more things about those unhelpful cultural narratives and assumptions that we need to unlearn. You know, within the American context, and it was while I was in college, actually, when I went abroad to India, that I realized is within America, humanity is so deeply defined by the work ethic. Yes. Right. Access to economic flourishing, the worthiness of one being seen as worthy of certain economic resources is so grounded in one's ability to work. We are measured by what we do. Like, what we do is who we are within this nation, right? You walk into a professional room and the first thing that someone asks you is, well, what do you do? And then what do you do? There's all kinds of measurements and and ideas and assumptions that people hold. I'm even thinking about, and this was not under the Trump administration at one point, this was like under the Biden administration where, and before that actually, this was actually under Obama as well, where one, as an immigrant, one's ability to get interest into this country had everything to do with how useful one was to the American political economy. What can you bring to this economy? How can you make us more profitable? How can you lead us in a better direction toward the bottom line? So I guess what I'm trying to say here, and I've been deeply informed by scholars, they're doing a lot of work around what they refer to as an anti-work ethic. And what they mean by that is in the sense of, if we're going to talk about what it means to be human, we just cannot begin with productivity and work. We just cannot begin with that. What it means to be human is so much beyond and more than that, right? And then as well, it's a very humanocentric understanding, right? I mean, in that sense, what it means to be human should be bound up with broader creaturely existence, right? With our more than human friends, right, within creation. And so I just wanted to say that some of this unlearning within faith communities, because I really want to keep focus here for my role in faith communities, is really really rethinking this, right? Even within churches, I've seen where there's certain seating for people that are professionals, versus those that are working class. I went to a mega church for many years in various places that I've been. Those that are working class sit in the back. I've seen folks that have walked up that are barely known sit on the second row, and they really need to be encouraged. They really need to work. An usher will walk right up to them and escort them back, because that's the reserved space for the important folks. Okay, so there's a way in which this idea, right, of work as meaning shows up, and I think that it's anti what it means to be human, but it's also just anti-Christian, right? The Christian story just turns that whole paradigm on its head, right? And then the other thing, and I wanted to circle back around in terms of cultural narratives that we must unlearn in terms of faith communities. Again, I'm speaking out of my context, being Black church community. I wanted to return to reproductive justice because I really do think that in the way that we talk about political recognition and economic equity or economic flourishing for communities, for Black communities, there's a way in which reproductive justice is seen as inconsequential, as peripheral, as secondary. We see this in elections, in which as Black community, you see this like on social media, as people are talking, it's seen as not the most important thing that we need to be attentive to in terms of reproductive justice. Yeah, we have other fish to fry, so to speak. We see this from the pulpit in terms of a kind of clumsiness almost, and I say that in the most open way, that we need a more capacious and creative and critical category, a way of talking about reproductive justice. And why? Because when we're talking about families, we're often talking about women that sit at the center. And as you just mentioned, we need a way, those identified as women, to have autonomy over our own bodies. But not just that, reproductive justice coined by Black women and women of color is about the right to mother. It's about not being stigmatized as a mother, which is what women of color and Black women have been dealing with throughout the life of this country. And so I think these are a couple of the things, right, that we really need to tend to.
That's right. Thank you. We're a little short on time, but I think we have time for one audience question if somebody... I think there's no mic there, so I can just give you mine.
So, as you were talking about the work ethic and defining work ethic, in education, we often talk about career and college ready. So how can we shift the narrative in education to see children as worthy of education because of the Imago Dei and not because they need to be college and career ready?
I promise. She did this to us. Please.
Calling me out. Calling me out.
Yeah. I wish someone had told me this in college, and that is, instead of chasing success, chase significance. You want to live a significant life, and that's going to be, that might necessarily be all the sort of the accoutrements, right? A certain kind of prestige or this, that, and the other. So I'm like, there's so much bound up with this narrative of success that you got to get into this college, you got to be this kind of brilliant. You have to, that makes, like students right now, they're so anxiety induced. I mean, they're just like in survival mode. I see this on our campus. But instead, reshift that. It's not about success in this kind of capitalist way of thinking about it, but it's about significance.
So, I would define value in terms of purpose, that to be able to achieve and define your purpose, and you get to choose that. So that to me, we should be trying to afford people the capabilities of identifying and fulfilling their purpose. In terms of education, so the data is that if we look across race, not only do disparities persist at higher levels of education, they worsen. So if you look at, I can give you data points. If you look at it is often the case that a Black person who's the head of a household with a college degree has less wealth than a white person who dropped out of high school. It's often the case that if we look at mortality differences between 25 and 65, there's about a 50% greater mortality rate for Black people If you add the criteria of a college degree, it goes to 70% ratio of black-white differences in mortality. So education is not the panacea, but we began with a notion of, I love education, and we should invest in education for the purpose of it in and of itself. Just like the question of reproduction, and we began with this, we're going full circle, we get to define the purpose of an economy. Love should be one of the purposes of the economy. King defined it that way. So the economy should serve the capabilities of people to identify and generate love. Same with education. Education has become a political ruse in that we put the onus of inequality on people by arguing that it's because of their lack of desire for education. Again, I'm an educator, and I think we should afford everybody access to a college degree in and of itself, because that is worth it. Then I'm going to conclude on this part and just say, and here's where we might have slight friction, in that it's not the only aspect of our identity, but production is a big component of the human identity. We want to be able to produce in non-exploitive and extractive environments, but from the day we're born, we want to contribute. Part of the reason why I support a federal job guarantee is that not being able to engage in some productive work is bad for the human spirit, but it's not the only component. But nonetheless, we should not cede our economy in a production realm to the other side that uses production as the input for the objective of accumulating capital in an iterative way for a powerful entity, but rather one in which that productivity is used to support an economy that centers people in the environments in which we live.
So as we conclude, because we're over time, what's one sentence around is an action that our community of faith-based leaders can do when they go back to advance the world that we've envisioned today?
I would just say continue to cultivate practices of deep listening, right? And being in solidarity, right, with hearing those that are really at the margins as faith communities, as we continue to address these various issues of economic mobility and families.
Thank you.
I was trying to find the Dr. King quote, but I'm not going to find it. I know we're out of time. But Dr. King talks about when he's in the Birmingham jail, the Ku Klux Klaner he's come to realize is not his worst enemy, but rather the white moderate. The lesson here, and then he goes on to talk about the juxtaposition of order versus justice. Given the time that we're in, and by the way, order and justice need not to be in conflict with each other. Indeed, tranquility is when they are working together. However, in this moment, if I have to offer anything, choose justice over order every day.
Thank you. Thank you all. Thank you for your patience.
Let's thank our panel.